Hi, and welcome back to Regaining the Balance. Today we're going to be doing a little historical overview of the 1500s. It's definitely going to play into a lot of the future research and a lot of the translations that I am in the middle of putting together for you guys for future videos. Some very, very interesting and bizarre translations of accounts that happened in between the flood of Rome and the end of the 1500s, the 16th century. But that's not the only thing. There's lots of stuff that happened during that period of time, and as I've been putting all this together, there's something that I've sort of stumbled across, and I guess we'll just get started right away with that. So let me get to the first page here and share you guys the screen. Okay, so we're going to go and start off with the quote, Holy Roman Empire. Okay, now the Holy Roman Empire was really a German, as was known as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, right? The Reich. It's a multi-ethnic complex of territories of Western and Central Europe that developed during the quote-unquote early Middle Ages, and we'll get into that in another video really soon when we do some chronological gymnastics, and I show you guys how the previous Roman how two different previous Roman empires actually match up with this particular Roman Empire. And the stories of the Goths and the Visigoths and all these other things are like identical to various things that happen during this time period. But I just wanted to throw this out here and then show you guys, of course, this map, which is the double-headed eagle, which we will be seeing a lot of. And nobody really knows where that comes from, so, let me just double check to make sure all the sound is working good. I'm not sure if it is or not because I don't hear anything. Ah, there we go. Yes, indeed. Okay. So, all right. So, moving on. Let's just remember that these guys here are the big players of this century. Okay. I also want to kind of go over the idea of this idea of called disaster capitalism, where terrible things happen to places and then certain powers come in and they sweep up and they take over, and that's going to be something you're going to see a lot of. So let's get to it here. Here we go yet again. The Holy Roman. Actually, that's the Russian Empire, right? And so, take a look at that. Take a look at this, or should I say, actually this. And they look quite similar to each other. And the thing is that they're related. As far as like the German backgrounds behind the later Muscovy kingdom itself was very much with German descent. So just want to put that out there. So we start off the 1500s with the death of Christopher Columbus, the guy who quote unquote discovered America, which I think most of us know that that's a bunch of bull. So, he dies at the very onset of this, and this is before things really started to pick up in terms of colonizing the Americas. There are a couple things that did happen, but one of the things I think is interesting is that it starts off really with the very beginning of the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, which, in my opinion, they already knew was already there the whole time. And let's see here, we have the Crimean Khanate, which is basically the end. 1502, we have here the end of the Golden Horde, the Great Horde, the great Tartarian Empire via the Genghis Khan and his many descendants for many hundreds of years there. That gets dismantled at 1502 and slowly starts to fall apart. And this is when you start to see the rise of the more Slavic Muscovites, so to speak. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but that's very important because these guys certainly held a certain power and prominence in the entire region of Tartaria, which is huge. It's this, okay, well, this is the Black Sea. Oh, what a weird map. Anyways, it's enormous, like Tartaria, the entire area of just Siberia. I mean, like the quote unquote the whole Crimean Peninsula, everything, all the way through to China. And that eventually fell apart here in 1502, which of course creates a vacuum. And so you have a lot of different things springing up from that. We have Habsburg Spain. Now, the Habsburgs are absolutely connected with the Holy Roman Empire because that is the basic family that ends up being the main family behind the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to see in another video soon how the history kind of folds onto itself. But the Habsburgs are important. Let's see here. So the Spanish Habsburgs take control in 1504, and Spain and Portugal are two of the big colonizers. Let's just say some of the biggest colonizers of this particular century. And because they're connected directly with the Habsburg Spain, the Spanish kings, the House of Habsburg, because they're connected directly with the Roman Empire, you can't really separate these two different kingdoms. Even though they try to, when they give you this stupid map here, they never include Spain, but it's obvious that Spain was part of the same family. So, not sure how that works exactly. However, they, as you can see, Spain and Germany and Austria, or that area, sort of traded off between emperors as far as Holy Roman emperors themselves. And so that's important to remember. It's not just Germany and that whole area, but it's also Spain as well, with France kind of sandwiched in the middle. And you'll see France is constantly embroiled in wars, and I don't think that's by mistake. Oh, go back to Christopher Columbus. Okay, and then we have here the Reformation, which kicks off in 1521. Or I should say, actually, yeah, was it 1521? Yeah, 1521. And, kicked off by Martin Luther in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a challenge to the Roman Catholic Church and the papal authority in particular. And so this really started another schism here. And what's very interesting is that when I get into some of the chronological stuff, we're gonna see how the Catholic Church was never really a unified. There's never really a unified thing. Even if you look at the official chronology, it was never really unified. But when you smash it down and you start to connect the different patterns from the early Christian church versus this period, or the 1200s, 1300s, 1400 period, they're very similar things happening. And what happened back then was what was called the Arian heresy, or Arian heresy, not as in Aryans with a Y, so it's a different type of thing. But here we go with the Reformation kind of creating this situation where people are tired of the papal authority in particular. Right here is very important to say, because the papal authority with the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically they were connected at the hip. These guys were really responsible for a large amount of the terrible murdering sprees and various other things that came out of Christianity. And these people were about power. They weren't about spirituality or anything like that. They were about control. And if that isn't, and hopefully by the end of this, and also adding on other videos, I'll definitely be able to show that. And they're still kind of in control, to tell you the honest truth. So, and then we have here the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. So in Mexico and whatnot, that started February 15th and raged on the way to 1521, and then 1522 to 1530. Interesting. So all the way up to 1530, which we know is an interesting time period, as we're going to get into. But one of the things that's interesting is the Spanish-Mexican War. They went in, they colonized part of the Mexico and whatnot, and then suddenly they decided they were going to build this the aqueducts in Mexico, which is hilarious because these aqueducts are basically Roman-style aqueducts, and the official story is that the conquistadors stopped basically pillaging and taking control of an area to build this. It doesn't make any sense at all. And this thing runs for hundreds of miles. So, what's the deal there? I mean, that's an obvious hole in our chronological history because there is no way the conquistadors stopped and built this thing. Look how small this person is here. You see that? It's enormous. It's just huge. And it, again, runs for hundreds of miles. And I'll have to do another, maybe bring up another video. But there's this old book of the early history of America, printed in the 1500s, which shows a diagram of Mexico City, and it shows this thing already in place, as well as a fully built city itself. So, a lot of weird stuff going on with that. And I think the conquest of the Americas had a lot to do with the World War that was really raging across the way. It was a battle for control. And we see it a little bit through our European history, but then you see it also mirrored through the history of the Americas and the conquistadors during this particular period of time. And now we have the Ottomans rise, and the peak of their rise is during the mid 1500s. But in between like 1520 and 1550s, I think, they were fighting essentially various people, but it was really the Holy Roman Empire. They were fighting the German Holy Roman Empire here. And as a point to that, I just want to point out that France and the Ottoman Empire united by mutual opposition to Habsburg rule, becoming strong allies. The conquest of Nice and Corsica, so 1543, 1553, occurred as a joint venture between the forces of the French and King Francis I and Suleiman, and were commanded by the Ottoman admirals Barbarossa, Hayreddin Pasha. And so, here you go. You have this whole thing, and I wouldn't be surprised if they had something to do with Hungary as well, because there is a very famous picture, and it's not included in this, but there's a very famous picture, maybe I'll bring it out in a different video, of a depiction of this battle in Hungary, where you see both Christian and Islamic flags and knights together facing against another enemy, which is probably this right here. Because that to me is very interesting that the France itself would actually connect with the Ottoman Empire if they were supposedly sworn enemies through the Crusades, which of course might be complete BS. We don't actually know, but we'll look into that for sure. But I think that's a very interesting point. Okay, guys, France and the Ottoman Empire in mutual opposition to the Habsburgs. What this probably means also, guys, is that France was not down with the way that the Holy Roman Empire, not just that, but the papacy itself, had basically hijacked Christianity. And we'll be looking into that a little bit more when we get into the timeline crunches that I'll be providing very soon. Now we have, of course, Ferdinand Magellan, who supposedly sailed around the Earth, and the first circumnavigation of the Earth. Okay, and then he's not the only one. There's like a dozen other people after him that do the same thing, and it's funny because as they're doing it, then they go back and they just start setting up their colonies. So, and again, he's Portuguese. Pay close attention to that. We'll look into something at the end of this, which should be very interesting. Now we have the German Peasants' War, which I found interesting, and I wonder sometimes whether or not this is a double for the Spartacus War in quote-unquote Rome, right? Because this is the Holy Roman Empire, and then you have a German Peasants' War, the Great Peasants' War, Great Peasants' Revolt. Peasants in those days were basically feudal, so essentially they were slaves one way or the other. Could be, I don't know. And we'll have to get to look into it. But it was definitely spurred on by this Protestant Reformation. And I think the fact that people were sick and tired of having to live underneath the yoke of this quote-unquote Holy Roman Empire, and which includes the the pontiffs and the Catholic part, the Catholic Church part of it. And again, they're all attached at the hip. There were definitely papacies that didn't necessarily like each other where the different popes didn't like certain emperors, but that didn't matter in the end because, as you're going to see, and this was a brutal war, by the way. I mean, the German aristocracy just murdered a ton of people, and it's an interesting read if you guys want to check it out. All of these links will be in the description box, by the way. All right, so then we have the sack of Rome, okay, and the sack of Rome was done by the soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire, but mainly the Spanish and the emperor or the king of Spain at the time didn't have enough money to pay his troops, so they just decided to sack the city because, which is a strange story. But anyways, taking a look at this, the growing power of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V alarmed Pope Clement VII, who perceived Charles as attempting to dominate the Catholic Church and Italy. Duh. In an effort to free both from imperial domination, i.e., from Habsburg dynasty, Clement VII formed an alliance with Charles V's archenemy, King Francis I. You see this guy? Guys, even the Pope knew what the real deal was. But I think that's part of like the fake kind of history as well, because from before this period of time, anyways, the Germans or the Goths or the Visigoths or any of those Germanic tribes that come from generally the same area were definitely already in this area. They had already populated it for the most part. And this, and so it's interesting. I think Clement VII, who's an interesting character, and it doesn't show up at all in the documents about the Roman flood, which happens 3 years after this. Okay, so what happens in the 3 years after this is we have the Roman flood, which we have had descriptions of it possibly being a flood that killed 100,000 people. There's no real number to it, but if you guys want to check out the video that I did, take a look at it. It's called the Terrible Deluge, or the actual destruction of ancient Rome, the Terrible Deluge. Check that out. So we had that flood, and 1 month later we have this flood. And I've had figures between 100,000 and 400,000 people died in this particular flood. Okay, and this is a big deal because what happened here in the Felix flood is that it destroyed entire parts of Belgium. It destroyed entire parts of some parts of the Netherlands. It hit parts of France. It actually flooded England pretty badly as well. And and then we're gonna see here. Oh, and so let's see here. I'm gonna skip these real quick. Okay, and so we have also the extreme weather events of 535 and 536. If you guys have never heard of this is actually pretty interesting. Were the most severe and protracted short-term episodes of cooling in the northern hemisphere in the last 2,000 years, supposedly. The event is thought to have been caused by an extensive atmospheric dust veil, possibly resulting from a large volcanic eruption in the tropics. Its effects were widespread, causing unseasonable weather, crop failures, and famines worldwide. Okay? If you guys have never heard of this, because I actually didn't hear this until I started digging into, what other kind of, because when I started doing research on the flood of the St. Felix and the Rome flood, I was like, well, what else is going on? And boy, did I find some stuff. The next 4 or 5 different documents I'm translating is all going to be related to this particular time period, guys. So it's very important that I wanted to lay this out for you guys, okay? So just quickly reading, the Byzantine historian Procopius recorded in 536 AD in his report on the wars with the Vandals, interesting, yet another German tribe, if I'm not mistaken. During the year, a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. The Gaelic Irish annals recorded the following: a failure of bread in the year 536 AD, and the annals of Ulster. And then again, the failure of bread in the years 536 to 539 AD, the annals of Innisfallen. Another phenomena were reported by a number of independent contemporary sources. Low temperatures, even snow during the summer. Snow reportedly fell in August in China during the northern and southern dynasties, which caused the harvest here to be delayed. Widespread crop failures, a dense, dry fog in the Middle East, China, and Europe. Drought in Peru, which affected the moche culture. And so they have a bunch of different explanations here, and that's the thing. This is a very important. I was just going to say that it's a very important thing. They don't give you much, But one of the things about the dense, dry, quote unquote, fog is you have a lot of these reports about this sort of gaseous air that are making people sick, and you see that in all the places they just mentioned here. And it's even mentioned in stories in Central and South America as well, in some of their mythologies and their histories or whatever else. They mention things like this that happen. So there's major stuff happening worldwide in the planet during the 530s, in the next like 20 to 50 years. And I think this is very important to pay attention to, because when we talk about disaster capitalism, things get screwed up, and then what do? They go around and they just take over everything. Okay, so going back to 530, after these floods, we have the Knights Hospitaller, or the officially called the Knights of Malta, which were formed in 1530, and they beat back a military campaign siege by the Ottomans, and I believe in Malta. But these were crusading knights, or crusading order of a German origin. I just want to point that out real quick, because these people have been around for a long, long time. Okay, and then what I was talking about before about the disaster capitalism, we have the Inca Civil War, right, where you have two brothers who basically fight each other. One of them eventually wins, and then is immediately destroyed, wiped out by the Spaniards. Right after it, as if the Spaniards were just sitting there waiting for this to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if they instigated the war in the first place somehow, because as soon as it was over, they actually came in and crushed the other brothers' army, which had already been decently decimated from fighting his other brother's army. And now the Spanish just come in and they grab him and they assassinate him and they take over. And it was just very quick for them. They didn't have to do much, it seems, which is a shame. But one of the things that's interesting about why did they go specifically to Peru to do that, I'm going to be bringing that back later on, because the Quechua and the Quechua language, the native Quechuas and the Quechua language, is actually related to a much more ancient connection that I'm going to connect in the near future. But the Spanish conquest of Peru, why did they have to go all the way on the other side of the continent if they didn't need to? It seems that could have been a waste of time, considering they had so much other land to really conquer, but they went on the other side of South America and conquered Peru. And I don't think that was by mistake. I think it was on purpose, because they knew what Peru stood for and the historical things that were going to pop out of it. All right, and now we have 1534. The Church of England is now splitting off from the official papal authority and decides to make its own church. All right, so we have more religious schisms across the way. And, all right, the weather events, yes. And what do we have here? Buenos Aires. So just as an example, I'm going to start showing you guys as we're going into it. So after the major events of 1530s, I think it's here. Yeah. After these events and a bunch of other ones, which I'm going to show to you guys, that's when you start to see a lot of these quote unquote founding of cities. So supposedly established in the February 2nd, 1536, by Pedro de Mendoza. Okay, so who knows? I think that this probably the city existed before they arrived, as is shown in this old history book, which I'll probably bring out, and maybe even I'll read it too. I'm not sure. The one I have isn't a great copy. And then we have the Portuguese Inquisition, which is interesting, and that starts 1536 and ends and then disbanded in 1821. Oh my God. Oh, I had no idea that it actually lasted so long. And of course, there's the medieval Inquisition. Yep. Which I think is really just the same Inquisition, or the Papal Inquisitions. Like, I think it was just one long Inquisition. They're just playing around with the dates here with us guys. But the Inquisition starts again right after all this disastrous things happen. And one of the things about the flood in Rome too is that Portugal also got slammed real bad by that flood and an earthquake, which apparently destroyed the royal palace. So we have so the Portuguese Inquisition comes in, which is smacking down all this, which is part of the strife, the religious strife, and of course they are, as all Inquisitions, not really very nice about it, are they? All right, so we have Recife, the fourth largest Brazilian city with now 4 million inhabitants. Okay, that was supposedly founded in March 12th, 1537. So here we go. Bogota, here we go yet again, right? And this one is established in, what was it, 1538. So and again, and all of these places have, they have the Greco-Romano buildings. They have all the same architecture that we see all over the world, the exact same. Okay, one of the funny things too about this is that when you go to the building, that there's a big building that's actually called the Roman Aqueducto or whatever else. It actually says it on there, and they have all these statues of these Greek gods. So again, if these were like, hardcore, Spanish Catholics trying to basically take over and supposedly convert all the savages, then why would they put a bunch of Greek gods statues all over the place? That, to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. So we got Bogota, and then of course right after that, in 1540, we have the creation of the Jesuits, and we all know about them, the kind of CIA slash military arm of the Catholic, or the Holy Roman Empire, I should say. And it's funny because a lot of their schools and their universities are located in Germany, but they were very active in France because one of the things they do is that they infiltrate from within and take things down. And that's what they also did in Japan as well. And they actually took over the city of Nagasaki, which is interesting. But this is when they were created, guys. So 1540. And that's the start of the big shift. So you have from 1530 to 1550s, and I'll show you guys soon. Actually, it's really 1530 all the way through until 1600s. It's just one major. There's so many different weather events that happen, and so much destruction that's not at all mentioned on Wikipedia, which I don't think is a mistake at all either. But these guys were created to basically, again, disaster capitalism, come in and wipe up the rest of it, and then replace these places with the right kinds of populations and the right kinds of education, and voila, there you go. And if I'm not mistaken, Ignatius of Loyola, I think he's the guy who said, "Give me a child, and by the age of 6, he will be a man of God forever," or something like that. Which goes to show you that they understand programming and pre-programming of human beings, and they're very good at it. Oh, and then we have Santiago, Chile. Look at that. And when was this? This was set up in 1541 by the Spanish conqueror Pedro Valdivia. And yeah, I mean, the Spanish, the Portuguese, again, the Holy Roman Empire, right? Because we don't want to forget that that's the Russians. We don't want to forget, oh, I guess I don't have it there, that the Holy Roman Empire does include Spain, because it just does. Many of them, many of the Spanish many of the emperors were from Spain, and the whole War of Spanish succession has to do with the power struggles within the empire itself. Then we have the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, or so they say. And that is just the basically meeting and absolute disagreement between the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, and the Catholics and the Counter Reformation, and basically they condemned each other, and that continued the strife that was to follow for a long period of time, until the no soul materialists took over. Let's just say. No, okay, so in 1547 we have the coronation of Ivan the Terrible, as he is called, Ivan Vasilievich, and he's interesting because he's called the first Tsar of Russia, supposedly. That's what they say on Wikipedia here. who knows if that's true, Grand Duchy of Moscow. And as you can imagine, the flag during that period of time was most than likely a double-headed eagle. And, in the future, I'm going to show you guys that the Catherine the Great and all that, they all came from German lineages, the same family, the same Holy Roman Empire Habsburg related family, the Witten family, all that kind of stuff. And now this one's great and interesting. This was a really interesting one, guys, because when I talked about disaster capitalism, let's bring it to the formation of the very first what would eventually become the modern stock exchange, the quote unquote Muscovy Company, also called the Russian Company or the Muscovy Trading Company, was an English trading company chartered in 1555. It was the first major chartered joint stock company, the precursor of the type of businesses that would soon flourish in England and finance its exploration of the world. The Muscovy Company had a monopoly on trade between England and Muscovy until 1698, and it survived as a trading company until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Since 1917, the company has operated as a charity, now working within Russia. Isn't that funny how all these like controlling corporate entities become charities later on, so to speak? Kind of like the various foundations that we all know of that are a bunch of crooked organizations. Anyway, so I think this is interesting because essentially what this is that this is the beginning of really beginning of the corporate of these corporate entities that are part of these countries, but really are also not part of these countries. And this one was one of the first. So here we go. We have corporations sort of setting themselves up here very early on in the 1500s, and I find that to be very fascinating. And I'm not really sure. It's interesting that it lasted up until 1917 as well, which should tell you a lot about the power of this organization. Okay, and now we have the I don't know why I put this one up here. Oh yeah, it's the Turkic Khanate. The was a Tartar state that arose during the breakup of the Golden Horde, and the existed in the 15th and 16th century in the area adjacent to the mouth of the Volga River. So what's interesting about this is that, if I'm not mistaken here, they were, yep, okay. So they basically broke off, and hold on a second, my cat is trying to get into a box. I apologize. She's distracting me. Okay, so said to have been founded in 1466, but did not become fully separate until the Golden Horde ended in 1502. And let's see here. The Khanate traditionally had military and diplomatic relations with Crimea, and sometimes let's see here, the diplomatic contact with Moscow began in 1532 or earlier. About this time, Moscow was expanding eastward toward Kazan, which it conquered in 1552. And that's the reason why I brought this up. It's because as you see the destruction of the Mongolian Tartarian Empire, okay, you see the rise of the Muscovy and these Slavs, I guess, or the Muscovites themselves, and you start seeing them move eastward, big time, and start to swallow up all these old these Khanates. They don't do it all at once, but it's over quite a bit of time. And then as that happens, and if you look at the lineage from the royalty of the Russians versus the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire royal family itself, you see that they are all part of the same thing. And so it might seem like this is just towards Russia itself, but in the larger context of it, it really has a lot to do with the Holy Roman Empire and its expansion and its connection with all these various places and how they all kind of use that conglomerated power to be able to take control, because one of these can't really do it by themselves. But a lot of them together, that's a pretty powerful force to have to go against. And not to mention, they're at the exact same time they're going across the world and just like setting up shop all over the place. So the next thing is going to be the 1556 Shangxi earthquake. It's one of the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. According to Imperial records, approximately 830,000 people lost their lives. So, like I say, the period between 1530, starting with the Roman flood, and going all the way up through the next 50 years, we see it, and there's I showed you the drop in temperature. What we see here is just something amazing. Just some kind of the earth itself is being turned asunder all over the place. And the thing is that I never really, until I started looking into a lot of these things, it never really occurred to me that like, oh, okay, well maybe this is why you see the expansion of some of these places and some of these powers, because they know that that things are cyclical, and so all they have to do is wait and prepare and then strike when they need to. And if I'm not mistaken, uh, the Mongolians, who were sort of being beaten back because the horde had started to fall apart, actually invaded China right after this, as an example. And we have Elizabeth I, who was coronated here on 1559, and of course she was quite the character in this particular period of time. And as much as she fought a lot of these people, the quote unquote Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish and all that other stuff. It didn't matter in the end because uh, the Holy Roman Empire ended up marrying into the British royalty and kind of took over. So now, one of the things I want to point out here, and I'm just going to really remind you guys about the St. Felix flood of 1530. So a little bit, about 30 years after the St. Felix floods, we have the Dutch War of Independence, which was a revolt of the 17 provinces that are today the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg against Philip II of Spain, who was, of course, the emperor at the time, the sovereign of the Habsburg Netherlands. After the initial stages, Philip II deployed his armies and regained control over most of the rebelling provinces under the leadership of the exiled William the Silent. The northern provinces continued their resistance. They eventually were able to oust the Habsburg armies, and in 1581 they established the Republic of Seven United Netherlands. The war continued in other areas, although the heartland of the Republic was no longer threatened. This included the origins of the Dutch Colonial Empire, which began with Dutch attacks on Portugal's overseas territories. How interesting! Which at the time was conceived as carrying overseas the war with Spain due to Portugal being a dynastic union with Spain. You see that again. Portugal is part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Dutch Republic was recognized by Spain and the major European powers in 1609 at the start of the 12 Years' Truce. Hostilities broke out again around 1619 as part of the Borders 30 Years' War. An end was reached in 1648 with the Peace of Munster, a treaty part of the Peace of Westphalia, when the Dutch Republic was definitively recognized as an independent country, no longer part of the Holy Roman Empire. So, and this peace, the Peace of Munster, is sometimes considered the beginning of the Dutch Golden Age. You would think so. When you don't have to live underneath some kind of horrible power like the Holy Roman Empire seems to have been. I can imagine it became a Dutch Golden Age. And the interesting thing else too, I want to point out is that the sack of Rome here by the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish and the Germans. They This was the end of the official end of the Renaissance right here. So yet again, you have these same people who are going around just taking things out, taking people out, going around creating these wars, and and the thing is that I think that the 80s they took advantage of the St. Felix flood for sure, because obviously, and that's probably why it took them 80 years to fight it, because they didn't have the kind of population probably in the very beginning to really mount an appropriate kind of defense. So we have the Russo-Crimean Wars, which were fought between the forces of Russia and the Tartars of the Crimean Khanate during the 16th century over the region around the Volga River. The 16th century, the wild steppes in Russia were exposed to the Tartars. During the wars, Crimean Tartars, supported by the Turkish army, invaded central Russia, devastated Ryazan, and burned Moscow. However, the next year, the Tartars were defeated in the Battle of Molody. Despite the defeat, the Tartar raids continued. As a result, the Crimean Khanate was invaded several times, conquered in the late 18th century. The Tartars eventually lost their influence in over the regions. And again, this is just another part of the remnants of the horde really completely falling apart and being swallowed up into this basically the Russian state, essentially. And so, this whole century here, right preceding it, or right at the very beginning of it, we see the death pretty much of the Tartarian Empire, and then slowly, bit by bit by bit by bit, it gets taken out more and more and more. Because as we know, or if maybe you don't know, but the Tartarian Empire was created out of many countries and many ethnicities. But for a long period of time, there was a lot of peace within that area. So here we have, very importantly, October 1582. It was the introduction of the Gregorian calendar, which is the precursor to all the calendar dates that we use today. And also, the next year, right after this was put out, Joseph Justus Scaliger put out his book on chronology. Okay, and so here we go. We have the new dating right here, and then the brand new chronological scale created by Mr. Scaliger. Okay, and not just that, but we have Caesar Baronius, who also happened to be living during this exact same period of time. And in 15, let's see here, I'm trying to just make sure I got the right date for this. So he was a historian, and he was a historian of the church. I'll say Baronius is best known for his Annales Ecclesiastici, undertaken at the request of Philip Neri as an answer to the anti-Catholic history, the Magdeburg centuries. This is interesting. We should probably try to find this one out, huh? 13 centuries covering 1,300 years, ending in... okay. All right, well, whatever. He began writing this account of the church after almost 3 decades of lecturing. Okay, yep. All right, this is the part that I wanted to show you guys. In the Annals, he treats history in strict chronological order and keeps theology in the background. Of course he does. But look, Gregorian calendar, Scaliger, and now Baronius. And, I don't know what to tell you, but I don't think this is a mistake. So continuing with this part here, because the second part's very important. Lord Acton called it the greatest history of the church ever written. Okay. And in the Annals, Baronius coined the term, quote-unquote, Dark Age, in the Latin form Saeculum Obscurum, to refer to the period between the end of the Carolingian Empire in 888 and the first inklings of the Gregorian reform under Pope Clement II in 1046. And as I'm going to show you very, 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 very soon, we're going to find out that this Dark Age is nothing more than an attempt to hide their chronological holes that they left in, which is hilarious because he's supposed to be a big, strictly chronological order. I don't think so. So we're going to take a look at that real soon. Now we have the Americas, the very first colony, Roanoke, Jamestown. If I'm not referred, oh, maybe it isn't. Yeah, I thought it was. Yeah, the first permanent English settlement in the North America, and on Roanoke Island, and everyone disappeared. And then after that, it was Jamestown. But this time period was 1585. And I didn't add in a bunch of other locations in Central and South America, but there's a lot more. I mean, you're just like, you see after 1530, the 1530s guys, you just see one after the other, after the other, after the other. There's just one thing being established, and then this city being established, that city being established. And I don't think it's by mistake. I think they took advantage of something terrible. because there was definitely some. If there was worldwide issues with sunlight for multiple years, then that's not nothing. All right, and so here the Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico is, let's see here, created in I think 1598 until 1610 was when they were kind of conquering this whole area. So as you guys can see, this is actually New Mexico, United States area here that they sort of took over. And the funny thing is about that too is that this is where like all the Hopis and where the Four Corners are and the Cliff Dwellers and all these things that show you that there was an actual real civilization that knew how to make houses and knew understood masonry and they didn't live in teepees. How interesting. Another part of this story where they come in, I think this is all part of, in my opinion, a big world war, but that's my opinion, I guess. Oops. Let me just continue with this here. And let's see here what else we have. We have the creation of the East India Company, and we all know how amazing these guys were, and how this was just a quote unquote an economical way to be able to go into countries and take over, i.e., India. The company also ruled the beginnings. The company also ruled the beginnings of the British Empire in India. How about that? Uh, oh my God. Yeah. So listen to this. Okay. In his speech to the House of Commons, July 1833, Lord Macaulay explained that since the beginning, the East India Company had always been involved in both trade and politics, just as its French and Dutch counterparts had been. And yeah, I mean, you know, this is this is what we get. Wow, can you imagine that? That's just insane. And this is what, for tea? You think it's just for tea? I don't think so. There's definitely interesting stories about the British going in and trying to destroy very ancient temples, and they could barely make a dent in them, which was good for the temples themselves. But we're going to get into that in the future because this is all again part of the whole thing. If and this to me is really shaping up to be something interesting, more like a world war than anything else. And then it sort of ends off with the creation of the East India Company and the burning at the stake at Rome of Giordano Bruno, who was a very interesting character and somebody who is going to be central to a lot of. He's a central figure in this time period because this is a time period between various religious strifes, and he kind of shows up out of nowhere. Kind of rocks the boat on both sides because he brings up some of the more ancient origins of these of our Abrahamic religions, and he was a very intelligent guy, but unfortunately he made a couple mistakes, got caught up, and then was put to death, and not just put to death, but burned alive in Rome. In front of a crowd, obviously in front of an audience, because his death was a message to the rest of these reformers, quote unquote, of the church, but really specifically they were very much to the Hermeticism that was coming out of this area, okay? And so I think it's about 15 years later, the very first Rosicrucian manifesto, written by quote unquote Rosenkreuz, which is not his real name. Uh, they put that out 16 years or 15 years after he died, and because they were part of this movement as well. And the thing is that a lot of the things that Giordano Bruno was bringing up ends up becoming something that is working itself out in the background in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. So he's an important character. Just to finish things off here, we have right at the very bottom. So when you look down here at the very bottom of the 1500s, or so the 16th century Wikipedia page, it's very interesting because when you look at exploration, let's take a look at this because this is part of my big point, right? I'm thinking right now that the 1500s, there was really truly a world war happening all over the world. the powers, the Holy Roman Empire decided to go out and to basically find all these places that had the history, the ancient history of the world, and slowly, one by one, attack and destroy and take over and erase the memory of the people and reteach them things. Okay, so let's take a look at the list of explorers here and see who they really were. Okay, so we got Vasco Nunez de Balboa, Spanish explorer; Gaspar, which is Portuguese explorer; Cabral, Portuguese navigator; Albuquerque, Portuguese explorer and statesman. Let's see here. Abreu and Francisco Serraro, Portuguese explorers. João Lisboa, Portuguese explorer. Jacques Cartier, there we go. We got one French explorer, and he's the quote unquote the discoverer of Canada. Sure. 1491, 1557. Okay. Francisco Vasquez del Coronado, who we all know is Spanish explorer, searching for the city of gold. Hernan Cortez, conquistador, okay, Spanish conquistador. We have Alvarez Nunez Cabez Vaca, which is another Spanish explorer. Andres de Urdaneta was a Spanish Basque navigator. Sir Francis Drake. Oh, and we got an English explorer here. Okay, the first English captain to sail around the world and survive. Juan Sebastian Elcano, we have Spanish, again, Basque explorer. Vasco da Gama, again, Portuguese navigator. Juan Ponce de Leon, Spanish explorer. Ferdinand Magellan, Portuguese. Mota, Portuguese. Or Orleana, Spanish. Pizarro, Spanish. De Soto, Spanish. Pinto, Portuguese. Timofeyevich, Russian Cossack ataman, conquered the Khanate of Siberia. Okay, so there you go. You see this? Okay, so the Russian here. He's a Cossack, but a hero in Russian folklore and myths because he, again, took part of what used to be the Horde or the Golden Horde or the Tartarian Empire, and another part of it's been destroyed here, as you can see, of Siberia, which is probably a very large area. Luis Vaz de Torres, Spanish or Portuguese, but see, he was within his own area, I guess. So, I mean, I'm counting him because it's important because it's still part of the destruction of the Tartarian Empire. But so is the rest of this. Giovanni Verrazzano is Italian explorer for France. Okay, so northeast coast of America from about the present day South Carolina to Newfoundland, which is interesting. So as you guys can see here, almost all I mean, there. What is it? 95% of all these explorers are either Spanish or they're Portuguese, which should tell you a lot. Because while the Spanish and the Portuguese, and this is the thing, what was going on here is that the Holy Roman Empire, and this is actually really interesting, especially when you relate it to old history and the parallelism. But the Holy Roman Empire is fighting wars on a world war on two fronts, on various fronts actually. They have their war against the Ottomans and also the French, right? And then they also have their wars against the indigenous people of Central and South and North America, whom I believe were there protecting. I believe that something happened during that 1530s to 1550 period, and they really took advantage of that kind of thing, and they claimed to found these cities, which I think these cities already existed, and I will show that real soon, because there's so many of these old pictures, not pictures, but excuse me, depictions of these cities that are completely built out, like the one in Mexico with the full-fledged aqueduct that was built hundreds of miles in the Roman, quote unquote, Roman style. And the thing is that what I'm kind of coming, what I'm, I guess I'll do some conclusionary statements here, but what I'm really kind of thinking here is that this has been a big world war here, and one of the things that's really interesting is that when you start to look at all these moves and you start to see how, like, how in the world can Spain and Portugal do this when they keep getting bankrupted, supposedly, right? And then, of course, there's this whole thing where they're bringing all the silver and gold from the Americas, which devalues all the money as well. So that's another point here. But really, what we're seeing here is just this. It truly is a world war because, and I didn't go too much into the Ottoman part of it, but that has a lot to do with it. The Ottomans and their battles, and how interesting that France would get together with the Ottomans to fight off the Holy Roman Empire. Like that was news to me when I first read that. I was like, holy smokes! Like I had no idea. And that kind of makes sense with some of these depictions when you see the Christians and the Muslims fighting, together against a common enemy. And here we go. And the interesting thing too is that, I know that the audiobook was long and it's very difficult with the Indian names and all, but the Indian origins of the Phoenicians and the part two about the Assyrians and the Aryans gives us a really great clue about how this could actually be very much a war that is much more ancient and old school than we've come to believe. Because the Aryans and the Phoenicians of India, the Pali or Pani, Panis, were mortal enemies with each other, and the Aryans constantly, they hated them, they chased them out, and a lot of it had to do about their actual viewpoints and their religious beliefs. And when you look at the Holy Roman Empire, it's the exact same thing. And so we have this very interesting thing here where people talk about Tartaria, they talk about the Phoenicians. It's funny how the Tartarian history has almost been wiped clean off of the history books, and then at the same time, the same is the case for the Phoenician history. The only Phoenician history we really have, guys, is as other historians referencing things about events that happen, but there's no Phoenician history. And one of the things we'll be looking into is interesting too, is this idea of Charlemagne chasing out the Moors out of Spain and all that kind of stuff, and how that might actually be a parallel story of Rome and the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. And I might actually have evidence of that in a real document. In a, let's just say a scan document from the early 1200s that's written in a very old French, what they call Norman French, which is actually even older than most of the French I go through, at least with a lot of the documents that we translate. But this one talks about how Charlemagne's son ends up becoming king or ruler of Carthage, which is very odd because Carthage supposedly wasn't called Carthage in the 1200s. It was called Tunisia. It's very interesting. So, we got some things coming up really soon, but I wanted to do this video because this video, to me, it was like a kind of like a precursor, and I'm going to reference a lot to the information I went over in this video because I think when you look at the big picture of all these different things that happen, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of control. There's power struggles all over the world. And the world seems to be being turned upside down. If you guys haven't checked out the Flood of Rome video yet or the Felix Flood video yet, definitely check those out. Those are worth checking out because they are both from documents dated of the period, and they're both accounts of the period. The Roman one is really interesting because it talks about people who didn't exist during 1530. But I will tell you now, I've been digging into some of Fomenko's work on his parallelism between different Roman empires, and I actually just kind of guessed the time differences when I did the video, and turns out I was almost spot on. So I'm going to share that with you guys real soon. But in order to do that, what I got to do is I have to create I have to create a really good visual presentation because the thing is that you have 3 or 4 different Roman Empire time periods. And then in the middle of it all, there is also a Judean Israel time period that is also a parallel to some of these. And they all are kind of ghosts of each other. And so we're gonna dive into that and do some real investigations, trying to find out a little bit of truth because those 2 Rome documents really, I mean, I never realized how important they were, but now that I've done a little bit more digging on it, I am absolutely convinced that whoever copied those did a sloppy job, and all they did was change the dates and not any of the information. And when you start to do the chronological gymnastics, it actually starts to make sense. So If you guys like the video, please hit the like button, share it with other people. So if you think they would be interested in this kind of subject, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. So I really appreciate you guys joining me today, and I hope this was an interesting kind of trek through this 1500s, this 16th century. And I'll be bringing a lot more back to sort of dismantle different parts of this timeline and show you guys how, especially with me using with a lot of Fomenko's work with this parallelism, how a lot of these stories are. There's a bigger story here behind it, and this idea of a world war, in my opinion, is on track. And maybe you guys might believe it or not. I don't know. Definitely, you guys will make your own minds, but it sure seems like a world war because. And I didn't go over any of the colonies that were happening in the east, or in Vietnam and all these areas as well, because there was stuff happening in the Philippines, Portuguese again, in the Philippines, all this stuff. Again, they're just going around. The Holy Roman Empire is literally taking over the world during the 1500s. And I think I showed that pretty well, just generally. But if you guys dig a little bit further, you'll see that that is very true. And the people fighting the Holy Roman Empire is also very interesting as well. And so I'm going to reserve judgment on some things, but overall, it seems like the real dominating power that really ended up creating what ended up being the spirit of, say, the United States and various movements for freedom came out from underneath this boot. So I think it's important we definitely look into that. Otherwise, thank you so much yet again for joining me. Much love to all you guys. And I will see you guys on the next video. Peace.